Today we're going to start our study on Baroque music. People who are lovers of early music say this is when the demise of music began. And for the rest of the folks in society, they say this is when the modern foundations of modern music actually began, when the foundations of modern harmony. And when you go to hear a concert of the symphony or of any big orchestra or band, they're going to be playing music typically not before the Baroque era, but you will hear pieces from the Baroque era through modern times. So here we go with the Baroque era. So it's time to start our third unit of study on the Baroque era, which lasted between 1600 and 1750. This starts part 4 of your textbook on page 119. Eras are named after the fact, after the time frame of that era. And people in the classical era believed that music during the Baroque era and art during the Baroque era was way overdone. And so they called it Baroque because Baroque meant bizarre, flamboyant, and elaborately ornamented. During the Baroque era, aristocracy was enormously rich and powerful, and splendid palaces were being built, and the rulers had absolute power. So these are some of the palaces that were built during the Baroque era. You can see the outside facade is just fabulous, and inside there was all kinds of columns and beautiful paintings on the walls, and everything was very elaborately done during the Baroque era. Baroque music expressed one basic mood called affections. So during the song, they wanted it to either sound happy or sad or contemplative or infatuated, whatever it was. They wanted the song to only have one emotion that was expressed in the music. Rhythmic patterns were repeated throughout the piece, whereas in some of the Renaissance music, we heard some interesting rhythms. The Baroque era wanted all the rhythmic patterns to be very repetitive throughout the piece. An opening melody will be heard over and over throughout the piece in various voices. This is called the fugue. It was the most popular, one of the most popular forms during the Baroque era. So that if it was a vocal part, you'd have the soprano sing the melody, and then later the tenors might come in with that same melody, and then you'll hear the altos come in with that same melody, and it would be heard over and over throughout the piece. Dynamic shifts were sudden. Part of that is because of the type of keyboard instruments that they had. The harpsichord in particular could only play loud or soft, and so there's a tendency to play loudly and then it would be soft. But you didn't have these crescendos and diminuendos. Singers could have done that, and organs could have done that, but for some reason they decided to have sudden dynamic shifts of either soft or loud, but nothing in between. Early Baroque music was homophonic, which means everything was moving together like a hymn. But as time passed, this polyphonic texture returned to favor. Chords and chord progressions became increasingly important, which resulted in stronger cadences and phrases. Basso continuo, which was usually a keyboard instrument like the harpsichord, maybe an organ, a clavichord, along with a cello or a bassoon, used figured bass, which was a shorthand of writing music which indicated what chord to play. The way this worked is that the bass line was written out, and then numbers were written either above or below the bass line so that the harpsichord or keyboard player knew what chords to fill in above it. And then vocal music melodies had many rapid notes on a single syllable of text. And so it said, instead of like, we went to the valley, it might, we went to the valley. And so they would throw all these different notes in on one word. Keyboard instruments were extremely popular during the Baroque era. And this is when keyboard music really began to flourish. This is an example of a pipe organ. Many churches today still have pipe organs, But most churches in the Baroque era would have a pipe organ, and each individual pipe has a different pitch. So you can see they would have humongously tall and big pipes for the really low notes. And those are the ones you see on the left. But then back behind, you would have these teeny tiny little pipes that would have the higher pitches. And so each individual pipe could only play one pitch. It had a little hole in the top of it, just like a whistle. And so the air blows up through the pipe and then goes and is split through this little opening in the tube, in the pipe there. And the organist would play with both their hands and their feet, as we studied a little bit about the organ earlier. And so you would have multiple keyboards for the hands, and then the feet would have a keyboard for them to play as well. Now, you had to get air through these pipes, right? And so you would usually hire a young boy or an older gentleman who couldn't get around and lift things maybe so well, but he could get the feet going, and they would pump the organ to get air to blow through the pipes. And they would just stand there for however long the organist needed to practice or play for the church service, and they would just pump back and forth with their feet and get the air blowing through the organ so the organist could play. So click on the YouTube link and listen to an example of a pipe organ playing. The harpsichord was another very popular instrument, especially with the royalty. They wanted to have a harpsichord in their ballroom, where they would have an organ in, they might have a chapel, they would have an organ in their chapel, but the harpsichord would more likely be in their ballroom where they would have their parties. And so you would have the harpsichord be in the center, and other musicians would gather around and play while there was a ball going on, or while there was a dinner going on, they would play music. And the harpsichord had a very light, delicate sound. Again, we studied the harpsichord in the first unit, but you'll see how the plectrum just goes up and plucks the string, and it can pluck either 1, 2, or 3 strings, depending how loud you wanted the sound to be. And then it comes back down, it doesn't pluck the string, and just comes to rest. And so it's made all of wood, and the strings were fairly light and delicate, and so it didn't have a really loud sound. Even when you played 3 strings together, if you'd had a large concert hall, you would not have been able to hear it. But if you're in a small ballroom or a small room where they might have dinner, you could hear the harpsichord well. So click on the YouTube link and listen to this example of the harpsichord. The clavichord was more of a practice keyboard instrument. It would not have been performed on nearly as much. And it was less expensive, and you see it's less ornate, not quite as extravagantly decorated. And so these would be in the homes of people who were maybe less wealthy, or perhaps it would be just, like I say, a practice instrument for the child of someone who was wealthy, and they would have a back room somewhere where they could practice the clavichord. And it was very, very soft. Actually, we'll study about Handel later, and his father didn't want him to be a musician, and so his aunt helped him get a clavichord up into the attic, and so at night he could sneak up there and practice and no one could hear him because it was a very soft instrument. And they have what are called tangents. It's a little metal kind of sliver of metal, and it would just go up and hit the strings. And it's similar to a piano in that it hits the string, but it's just kind of a delicate hit of the string, and it really does not have a really loud sound. It could get gradually louder and gradually softer, but the dynamic range was kind of like pianissimo, very soft, to maybe mezzo piano, medium soft. It just never could get very loud, but it was great for a practice instrument. So click on the YouTube link and listen to a clavichord. The Baroque orchestra was also growing in size and popularity. It was based on the string family, which included your violin, viola, cello, and bass. They could be well heard, they were well developed in their sound, and they matched well with the harpsichord. At the center was the basso continuo, which again was the harpsichord plus a bass instrument, usually a cello or a bassoon. And sometimes you added recorders, which, remember we talked about the recorder, which are often still played by school children today. But it was a very mellow early flute. And they were also joined by flutes and oboes, and bassoons were added sometimes, especially the recorder, because they blended well with the strings. If it were a festive occasion, you had trumpets and timpani were added. But that's all the percussion you really had added into the orchestra, was just the timpani. Remember, those are the larger drums that were in different sizes and could be tuned. And trumpets they didn't have the pistons yet, or the valves, so the trumpet was limited in its ability to play without having to change a bunch of tubing. And so the trumpets were thrown in for kind of an accent and special occasion, in the timpani, but they were not used regularly. And composers often rearranged their own or other composers' works for different instrumentation. So they would say, this might have been for a choir, now I'm going to rearrange it for instruments. And this one was written for, the string family, but I want to add more flutes this time. And so they would take other people's other composers' works and do the same thing. They would rearrange it and then just put their name on it. There were no copyright laws. Whoever they worked for, the king or the queen or the duke, they just wrote for them, and they would borrow other people's music and rewrite it and just take credit for it. No one thought anything of it, because once that composer was gone, they brought in a new composer, and the old guy's music would pretty much be tossed. And so we lost a lot of early composers of the Baroque era. We lost a lot of their music due to the fact new guy comes in, throw out the old stuff, because the new guy's going to write new things for the upcoming parties and church services. This is a painting of what the Baroque orchestra would have looked like. You see in the background the harpsichord. In front of the harpsichord, you see a cello and a bass and a violin. Toward the back on the left, you will see 2 flute players. But they were just not really large, and gathering around the orchestra are the benefactors and his friends, and they're just gathering for some music at dinner, or for drinks, or for a dance, or for a meeting of some kind. And if the benefactor wanted some music, or the king or queen, as I'm saying, the employer wanted some music for his event, they would all get together and play. On pages 132 and 133, you will see the listening guide to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. This is a concerto grosso. A concerto grosso is the orchestra with a small group of soloists. So the king or the queen or the duke or the prince would hire in the best musicians he could, and they would want to show off their soloistic abilities, but all of them wanted to have a solo. So in a concerto grosso, multiple musicians can play a solo. On page 132, you see the word tutti. That means everyone play. Then you'll see solo, and you'll hear a flute, violin, those are your soloists, playing with a harpsichord. And then you go back to tutti, everyone plays. And then you go back to the solo, which is for the flute and the violin, again with a harpsichord playing in the background. So when you have the tutti, you have the forte, which is loud. And then when you have the solo, it's much softer. And this is where you get your terrace dynamics. You have your forte loud, and your solo is going to be more piano, and you'll have your softer sounds. So listen to the recording. Now that you've listened to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto, let's look and see how music was used in society. First, music was the main source of entertainment for the bored aristocrats. They had dinner parties, operas, court concerts, and church services. So they didn't have a whole lot to do. The aristocrats didn't. They had servants to do everything for them. They were bored. They didn't have TV. They didn't have places of entertainment that they could go to. Everything was kind of self-contained in their palace. And so these musicians provided entertainment for these bored aristocrats and nobility. The courts employed an orchestra, a chapel choir of singers, and opera singers. So the number of musicians that they hired in, depending on how large the court was and how wealthy the aristocrat was, the more people they would hire in to play in their orchestras and sing in their choirs and sing in their operas. The music director supervised performances, composed the music, kept all the instruments in good working order, maintained the music library, and were one of the highest paid servants. So during this time, servants were still paid, but the maid and the butler or the person who was the cleaning lady or the cook, they might not get paid as high as as much as the music director. Church music was either accompanied by the organ or by an orchestra. They didn't use the harpsichord or the clavichord in church music. It was not loud enough to be able to have been heard. And the church music director composed the music for the services. They trained the choir boys, teaching them how to sing, how to play musical instruments. They played the organ, or they directed the orchestra, but they were paid less than the court musicians, which is still basically true today. People who are doing rock concerts and things like that are paid more than a church musician. Also, some of the composers wrote opera for the commercial opera houses on the side for some extra income. So there was some of the aristocrats maybe weren't wealthy enough to own their own opera theater in their home or their own chapels. And so there were some commercial opera houses that were beginning to start, and composers could get a little extra money by writing music for these events. On pages 135 through 136, you will find a listening guide to Bach's organ fugue in G minor. You'll read about the fugue, which is a polyphonic composition based on one main theme called a subject. So remember, polyphonic is multiple melodies overlapping one another. And you have this subject, which is the main theme, and you keep hearing it in different voices. You'll hear it in the highest voice, then you'll hear it in the lowest voice, then you'll hear it in the middle voice. And so follow that along as you listen to this recording of the organ fugue in G minor by Bach. As we begin our third unit of study about the Baroque and Classical eras, be sure to keep up with your reading assignments and listening assignments. This will help you better understand the material in your lectures. All right, we'll see you next time.